What's good, guys? Fantasy Joe back here with my running back rankings, doing my top 12 half-point PPR RBs today. If you guys haven't checked out my wide receiver rankings, make sure you check that out. I have a ton of these fantasy profiles on the channel if you want to look at individual players' outlooks, mock drafts, league winners, all that stuff on the channel as well. So check that stuff out. Make sure you hit that subscribe button. Please hit that sub button. You're going to stick around. Like, comment really helps out the algorithm, and I respond to all comments. Let's talk Christian McCaffrey. Okay, so last year in 2021, Christian McCaffrey finished at RB39, averaging 15.6 points per game. Obviously didn't play in many games, only appeared in 7 contests. If we look at the last 10 games Christian McCaffrey's played, though, 7 of those games he's finished as a top 5 running back. He wasn't even healthy for the entirety of all those contests. If we look back to 2019, the last year he's healthy, he averaged 25.6 points per game in half-point PPR. He's just an absolute difference maker when he's healthy. He is the number 1 running back if he can stay on the field by a mile, just because of the domination that he has in the passing game. He's already had 2 seasons with over 100 receptions, has a season with 1,000 receiving yards, 1,000 rushing yards, is also utilized on the ground heavily as a difference maker in the running game as well. Has not been a ton of talent around him his entire time in Carolina, and it hasn't mattered. He's produced for fantasy regardless. With their first round pick this year, they drafted an offensive tackle who's a dominant run blocker. I think that helps Christian McCaffrey this season. Obviously, I think adding Baker Mayfield too is an upgrade for the entire offense overall, as well as for Christian McCaffrey. The one thing I'll point out, they have the number 24 ranked offensive line this year. But like I said, Christian McCaffrey's dominated in fantasy in the past, and he's never had a ton of studs around him. For his stat prediction, I'm projected for 250-plus carries, 1,100 rushing yards, 100-plus receptions, 800-plus receiving yards, and 13-plus total touchdowns. He's an absolute smash play, and sure, he could get hurt, but so can any running back, and that's why he's still my number 1. He's the biggest difference maker in fantasy football. If he hits and he's on your team, you have a great chance to win your league. My running back 2 is Jonathan Taylor. In 2021, he finished as an RB1, averaging 20.8 points per game. He had 332 carries for 1,811 rushing yards, 18 rushing touchdowns, caught 40 passes for 360 yards, and 2 receiving touchdowns. Has the 10th ranked offensive line this season, according to Pro Football Focus. And he got Matt Ryan, which I think is an upgrade for the offense in general. I think he'll just make them more consistent, able to move the chains more consistently, things like that, which I think will all be good for Jonathan Taylor, who I think will still receive a massive workload. Another thing to point out with the addition to Matt Ryan is Matt Ryan last year in Atlanta had 2 running backs that caught more passes than Jonathan Taylor. You could say this was due to game script, but I think a lot of it has to do with Matt Ryan's play style. So I think Jonathan Taylor will catch more passes than he did last season, which raises that floor for him. He's already a difference maker in the ground game with that good offensive line. Not only does he get a ton of carries inside the 5, which gets you touchdown opportunity each and every week, he has that big play ability where he can take it 70 yards to the house, score a touchdown, and make his entire week on one play, or just put that gravy on top of that week that murders your opponent. He's an absolute difference maker. I have no problem if you want to take him at the 101. He gets so much work on a good team, and he's a very, very talented running back. Like I said, I think he catches more passes this season. I think he's going to continue to have a ton of touchdown opportunity when you look at those carries inside the 5. That's what predicts touchdowns year over year. For his 2022 stats, I've been projected for 315-plus carries, 1,600-plus rushing yards, 50 receptions, 400-plus receiving yards, and 16 total touchdowns or more. My number 3 running back is Derrick Henry. In 2021, he finished as the RB16, although only playing 8 games, but he averaged 23 points per contest. If we look at his stats, he had 219 carries for 937 yards, 10 rushing touchdowns, an absolute crazy 27.4 carries per game, and his receptions were up. Last year, he had set 20 targets, 18 receptions in 8 games. The year previously, he only had 19 receptions the entire year. He is an absolute volume monster, just gets the rock a ton year over year. If we look at his finishes, in 2019, he finishes RB3 with 19 points per game. In 2020, RB2, 20.2 points per game. The volume he receives on the ground, the amount of yards that he racks up, and the amount of rushing touchdowns are absolutely insane. And when you see those receptions coming up last year and now A.J. Brown's gone, have new options, new faces for Tannehill to throw the ball to, I think a few more of those passes could get checked down to Derrick Henry, although I don't think he gets anywhere close to the same volume he had on the ground. I just don't think that's repeatable. If he does, I think he'll probably get injured again. I just don't know if any running back can sustain 27 carries plus per game, game over game. It's a lot to withstand, but it is also a ton of it brings a ton of fantasy success with that type of volume. The biggest concern, I think, for Derrick Henry is the offensive line, and this is the offense in general, losing some pieces, being a little less effective. But the offensive line, according to Pro Football Focus, is ranked 27th entering this season. He's always had a pretty solid unit. Last year, at the end of last season, they were ranked 14th, lost some key pieces. So he could be a little bit less efficient than previous seasons, but I still think he'll just get so much volume. And I'm not too concerned about him with this foot injury. Once you get 10 weeks, your chance of re-injury goes from 20% to 10%. So that was a nice thing for him to get all that time off. Now he's a full off season as well. I have him projected this year for 330 plus carries, 1,400 plus rushing yards, 30 receptions, and 13 plus touchdowns. My number 4 running back is Austin Ekeler. In 2021, he finished as the RB2, averaging 18.8 points per game. He had 206 carries, 911 rushing yards, 12 rushing touchdowns, racked up 70 receptions, 647 receiving yards, and 8 receiving touchdowns. That's actually the second season he's had 8 receiving touchdowns. He gets an absolute ton of volume in the passing game. That's why he's so high on this list. Another guy, too, I don't have a problem if you want to take him over Derrick Henry, especially when you look at the quality of the offenses around him, offensive line, things like that. And the pass catching that he's going to get, I think he'll be more consistent week to week. And obviously, yes, as Justin Herbert has a 12th ranked offensive line this year. The biggest thing for him, I think his receptions number and his overall efficiency in the passing game could even come up a little bit. He's got a 90 reception season in his past. I think he could get 70, 75 receptions, maybe even 80 this year. I think that's well within the realm of possibility, but I do think his touchdowns will come down. He had 20 total touchdowns last year. They bring in Isaiah Spiller. I think they want to have a back to complement Austin Ekeler, and they just really didn't have anyone talent-wise who could do it last year. I think that back is Isaiah Spiller. I think he'll steal some work. Now, I still have Austin Ekeler ranked as my 4th ranked fantasy running back. I just don't know if he'll finish as 2 and ever have that many touchdowns again. But like I said, he could be more utilized in the passing game if they have Isaiah Spiller to handle more of that rushing game potentially, even if he steals a few touchdowns and some work. Austin Ekeler is a dynamic player, extremely efficient in the pass as well, so I'm not worried about him. Even if he loses a little bit of the volume that he had this year, I still think he'll be a dynamite fantasy option. I'm projected for 800 rushing yards, 75 plus receptions, 700 receiving yards, and these are both plus, 800 plus rushing yards, 700 plus receiving yards, and 12 plus touchdowns. Okay, my running back 5 is Dalvin Cook. 2021 finishes the RB15, averaging 14.6 points per game. Only appeared in 13 games, had 249 carries, 1,159 yards, 6 rushing touchdowns, 34 receptions, 224 receiving yards, and 0 receiving touchdowns. The biggest thing with Dalvin Cook this season, I think the touchdowns bounce back. If we look at his previous 2 seasons, he had 16 rushing touchdowns a year previously, 13 rushing touchdowns in 2019. Had a good amount of carries inside the 5 last year, had 12 in 13 games, and only turned that into 3 rushing touchdowns. He's a big play guy as well who can get it done on his own, but I think he'll get a lot of carries inside the 5 this year, and he just got kind of unlucky last year, and they'll turn into more touchdowns this season. Minnesota's also said that they want to throw the ball more this year, which I don't think is necessarily a negative thing for Dalvin Cook, because I think he'll be used more in the passing game. They said that as well, that they want him to be more involved. I think this coaching change overall just opens up his potential a little bit more. He's still going to get a lot of the rushing work. He's the best option for the team. So I think he's good for 250 carries, and I think he's more involved in the passing game where I think he can be a dynamic talent, get the ball in space, add to that, baseline each and every week. He is a bell cow in this offense that looks to improve a lot. They have the 19th ranked offensive line entering this season. I'm projected for 1,500 plus yards, 12 touchdowns, and 40 plus receptions, which would be an uptick from last year. I think he could easily hit all these numbers. I think he's one of the best values in drafts where he's currently going. Like I say, he's my RB5. See him going the back end of first rounds. I love starting my draft with Dalvin Cook at the back of the first round pick. I think that's a great value every single time I'm smashing that draft button. My number 6 running back is Joe Mixon. In 2021, finishes the RB3, averaging 16.7 points per game. He had 292 carries for 1,205 rushing yards, 13 rushing touchdowns. Also caught 42 passes for 314 yards and 3 receiving touchdowns. This is by far his best season of his career, but it's also he's been a very talented running back for years behind a bad offensive line, a bad offense. Finally had a good offense with Joe Burrow last year, had a poor offensive line still, and he was still able to have those type of numbers. And now entering this season, they have the most improved offensive line in all of football, ranking number 8 this season. They're at 25 at the end of last year. Entering this year, they're ranked number 8. Major improvement. I think it opens up lots of opportunity for Joe Mixon to increase his efficiency, which I think he'll have similar type of volume. Now, will the touchdowns stay the same overall? Very unlikely, but they've also said they plan on using him a little bit more on third down this year, so I think that 40 reception mark is kind of his baseline. I think he'll get right around 40 catches. And, if he does have a season where he catches 50, he could be an absolute monster for fantasy. I think he could very easily finish as a top 5 running back this season when you look at how much volume he gets and how good of an offense he's a part of this year. And like I said, that offensive line, I just think opens up things for him efficiency-wise. He is a really talented runner, and now I think he'll get more opportunities to gash defenses, make long plays, do things like that. His yards per carry last year were 4.1. I wouldn't be surprised at all if that gets up to 4.5. or something like that. Not a major improvement either. He could be 4.8. I have his stat predictions for 1,600 plus yards, 13 plus touchdowns, and 35 plus receptions. And like I said, with that recent news that they plan to use him more on third down, I think he could easily be in that 40 plus reception range, especially if the Bengals do try to throw the ball a little bit more. And even if they do that, he's still going to have all the scoring opportunities for this offense around the goal line, which is going to be huge for him, and such a good offense with a good offensive line now as well. My number 7 running back is DeAndre Swift. In 2021, he finishes the RB19, averaging 13.7 points per game. In 13 games, he had 151 carries, 617 rushing yards, 5 rushing touchdowns, 62 receptions, 452 receiving yards, and 2 receiving touchdowns. The Detroit Lions have an absolute fantastic offensive line, ranked number 3 entering this season. And as we saw from his season last year, catching 62 passes in only 13 games, he is excellent in the passing game, brings that Austin Ekeler-esque baseline to him, as well as being involved in a talented runner in between the tackles with a very talented offensive line. I think the arrow is very much pointed up for DeAndre Swift, who became more involved as the season progressed last year with Dan Campbell. And this year they have more weapons around him, which I think is just good for the offense in general, good for scoring opportunities. They bring in Jamison Williams. Amon-Ra St. Brown broke out the end of last year when he was hurt. TJ Hawkinson's back again. And like I said, a great offensive line, and Jared Goff, who has a propensity to throw to the running back. I think all these things are really good for DeAndre Swift, who, like I said, I think can be close to what we saw Austin Ekeler be, 2-3 seasons ago, before Justin Herbert got there when he was with Phillip Rivers. Not the best offense in the world, but is utilized heavily in the passing game and is going to have opportunities to score when the team does get down there. They do have Jamal Williams, but I think DeAndre Swift will be more involved this year, and just the involvement he gets in the receiving game alone is going to make him a force for fantasy football, even if the rushing volume doesn't go up, although I expect it to, and I think his efficiency could increase as well and have more scoring opportunities this season. I have his stat predictions for 850 plus rushing yards, 70 plus receptions, 500 plus receiving yards, and 10 touchdowns. Number 8, I have Najee Harris. Last year finishes the RB4, averaging 15.5 points per game. Was an absolute volume monster last season. The amount of carries he got, 307 carries, 1,200 rushing yards, 7 rushing touchdowns, as well as 74 receptions for 467 yards and 3 receiving touchdowns. The biggest thing I think with Najee Harris this year, we had to point out, I think the receptions likely declined pretty drastically with the loss of Big Ben, who was grabbing the ball as quickly as he could and checking it down to Najee Harris about half the time. I think just play style-wise, the new quarterback with Trubisky, who can extend things with his legs, Kenny Pickett showed that in college as well. I think they'll hang in the pocket a little bit more, throw to Najee significantly less, and obviously receptions for running backs are absolutely huge for creating that baseline when you get all that rushing work as well. I do think he'll receive a ton of volume, though, because they're going to have Mitch Trubisky or a young Kenny Pickett playing this year. I think they'll be a very run-heavy team, but they have the 30th ranked offensive line in all of football. So I think that's a major concern. Najee Harris wasn't crazy efficient last year, and now I think the offense has even gotten a little bit worse as far as his fantasy production. Like I said, Big Ben is going to, I think he could go from 74 receptions to 40 receptions, 45 receptions, somewhere in that range, but that's a big loss. And I just have concerns for him, although I think he'll get enough volume and is a young back still. Don't think he'll have a ton of scoring opportunities, though, and that's why I have him at 8 this year. His 22 stat predictions, I've projected for 1,300 plus rushing yards, 45 plus receptions, and 10 touchdowns. My number 9 ranked running back is James Conner. In 2021, he finishes the RB5 overall, averaging 16 points per game. So last year in 15 games, he had 202 rushes for 752 rushing yards, 15 rushing touchdowns, also caught 37 passes for 375 receiving yards and 3 touchdowns. He got a new contract this offseason, 3 years, $21 million, $13.5 million guaranteed. A good amount of money for a starting running back. It's enough money to make me think he is definitely the starter, especially when you look at the depth chart. No more Chase Edmonds there. Now it's Darrell Williams, Benjamin. I think James Conner will be the number 1 running back. He'll get a ton of opportunity around the goal line like he did last year. He was number 2 in the NFL in carries inside the 5-yard line. They love to run it right up the middle. Their center, Rodney Hudson, who's a very talented player, the most talented in their offensive line, which ranks 25th. Not great, but like I said, he was able to score touchdowns with them last year, even if he wasn't very efficient on the ground. And he caught a ton of passes when Chase Edmonds is out. And that really opens up. If you're scoring a lot of touchdowns, getting volume on the ground, and catching a lot of passes, that's a stew that's good for fantasy football. You mix all that together, that's very good. In 2022, I've projected for 1,300-plus yards, 50-plus receptions, and 17 touchdowns. I think he's going to continue to be a touchdown monster. And even though he might not be as efficient on a per-touch basis for touchdowns, I think when all those touches come up, he can still score around the same amount of touchdowns as long as he's using that similar role and can stay healthy throughout the season. My number 10 running back is Aaron Jones. In 2021, he finishes the RB12, averaging 13.5 points per game. He had 171 carries for 799 rushing yards, 4 rushing touchdowns, caught 52 passes for 391 receiving yards and 6 receiving touchdowns, only appeared in 15 games. The biggest thing for him has A.J. Dillon as competition. I think A.J. Dillon will receive a ton of volume on the ground. I think they'll be more of a run-first team this year. I think A.J. Dillon can steal a lot of those touchdowns on the ground, which is what made Aaron Jones so good for fantasy years previously. He had crazy touchdown upside because he was a goal line back. I'm not saying he won't ever be utilized on the goal line, but I do think A.J. Dillon will get a lot of that short yardage work. But I do think Aaron Jones' involvement in the passing game goes up dramatically with Davante Adams' departure. He averages 4.5 receptions in games that Davante Adams doesn't play. I think that trend continues as he's one of the Packers' most trusted pass catchers, and they have very limited options this season. I do think they'll be run first, but I still think the receptions bring Aaron Jones to a level where he'll be good for fantasy. I still think this offense will be good, and he is a dynamic enough player to create scoring opportunities for himself, and this offense will as well. He also has the 5th-ranked offensive line entering the season. One thing to point out there, though, David Bakhtiari just had surgery on his knee. Unknown if he'll be ready for the start of the season. That would be a big loss for Aaron Jones. Although as long as they get Elton Jenkins back healthy, that would still be a nice plus for them. They had a banged-up offensive line last year. I think that's part of the reason for Aaron Jones' inefficiency. I don't think he's lost it. I still think he's a good player. And I think if they have an improved offensive line, which they should this year, he will prove it. My number 11 running back is Alvin Kamara. In 2021, he finished the RB8, averaging 16.3 points per game. He had a career high in carries last year. 13 games, 240 carries, 898 rushing yards, 4 rushing touchdowns. Had 47 receptions for 439 receiving yards and 5 receiving touchdowns. The thing to point out, obviously the career high for him in rushes despite playing in only 13 games, but by far the lowest receptions of his career with that 47 number. Every year previously he posted at least 81. What I think happens, Sean Payton is departed, so I don't think his receptions go back to that 81 number, but I do think he's still a 60 reception back. And I think he will get a lot of volume on the ground as the team needs him. Maybe not as heavy as it was this last year, but he's going to get more volume, and I think that will make up for some losses in the efficiency of the offense overall, as well as him not being utilized as much in the offense on passing downs. I do think the more weapons around him on offense, though, will help open up his efficiency for this upcoming season. Averaged 3.7 yards per carry last year, but now that they added Chris Olave, have Michael Thomas healthy, have Jarvis Landry add to this roster, I think teams will have more to focus on than just Alvin Kamara, and that'll open him up to make some more plays. They do have the 21 ranked offensive line entering this year. But with all that said, with touchdowns being down and receptions being down and all those things for Kamara, he still averaged 16.3 points per game and finishes the RB8. I think all those things can go back up for him. I don't think he's lost anything. I think he's going to be put in a position to receive a lot of volume and a position to succeed for fantasy football. The biggest question mark with him right now is just where he's suspended. I think he'd be higher in my rankings if I knew he wasn't going to be suspended. I'm kind of hedging a little bit in between. It could be, anywhere up to 6 games, I think. I think he probably gets 3 games, though, or nothing. if I was going to bet. I'm projected for 1,000+ rushing yards, 60+ receptions, 500+ receiving yards, and 12 touchdowns. My number 12 running back is Leonard Fournette. In 2021, he finishes the RB5, averaging 15.8 points per game. In 14 games last year, he had 180 carries, 812 rushing yards, 8 rushing touchdowns. Finished with 69 receptions, 454 receiving yards, and 2 receiving touchdowns. Caught a ton of passes last year. Has a great offensive line as well. Number 4 ranked entering this season. Ton of touchdown upside with that offense. We know that offense is going to be good. And if you're the running back for a good offense, you will be granted scoring opportunities. They also gave him a new contract as well. 3 years, $21 million, $12 million guaranteed. A good chunk of money to say that he is going to be the guy this year. They did draft Rachaad White in the third round. Rachaad White had 43 receptions last year. I do think Leonard Fournette will lose some receptions to him. That will bring down his fantasy ceiling. But I think the financial commitment that the Buccaneers made to him will still be large enough that he'll be utilized heavily, get enough of those scoring opportunities around the goal line. I know Tom Brady already trusts him enough in the passing game that he'll receive opportunities there. Obviously, there's been a lot of rumors about his weight entering this year. I just think he has enough time where if he doesn't come out for that first preseason game looking, extra thick, I'm not going to be concerned about it. The only concern I have really with the weight thing is just I think he has a higher propensity to get hurt. He's dealt with a lot of ankle injuries in his career. I think playing at a higher weight increases the likelihood of those ankle injuries, especially since he is a bigger back. But I do think he can get down, it's plenty of time to get down to 235 or wherever he wants to play at as his reported playing weight. His 22 stat predictions, I have him projected for 250+ carries, 1,000 yards, 40+ receptions, and 13 touchdowns. If you guys have made it to this point in the video, please hit that subscribe button, hit that like button. It really helps out the video. And if you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comment section down below. Let me know who should have made the list, who shouldn't have, who should be higher, who should be lower. Let me know what you guys think down below. I really do appreciate it and it helps out the video. I'll respond to all comments like I said. This has been Fantasy Joe. Thank you guys for watching. See you next time.